My name is Karen, I'm 62 years old, and I smiled at the woman who slept with my husband, because I already knew how I was going to destroy them both, without raising my voice, without saying a single word. They say you never forget the moment when your world truly changes. Not the loud, obvious moments like weddings or funerals, but the quiet ones, the ones that slip into your life like a thread of smoke through a crack in the window, unnoticed until the smell of something burning becomes too strong to ignore. For me, it was that birthday dinner, the one where I smiled at my daughter-in-law across the table, poured her another glass of wine, and thanked her for the beautiful cake she baked for my son, even though I already knew what she had done a few nights before. My name is Karen, I'm 62, and that night I decided to pretend. Not because I was weak or afraid, but because sometimes the most elegant revenge is letting people hang themselves with the rope they think they're using to control you. It's strange looking back now how many small things I missed or ignored. The way she laughed too loudly at my husband's corny jokes, how her hand lingered a second longer than necessary when she passed him a plate, the sudden shift in his cologne, that unfamiliar sharpness I noticed on his shirt one afternoon and couldn't quite place. But it all seemed harmless at the time, easily brushed off as coincidence or imagination. After all, Rachel had always been the charming one. She knew how to smile with her whole face, how to hug just long enough to feel sincere, how to say thank you with a hand on your arm that made you feel seen. When Mark married her, I honestly believed I was gaining a daughter, and for a while, it felt that way. Tom and I had been together for 38 years by then. We had our share of problems. What couple doesn't? But I never thought we would end like this, circling each other like strangers waiting for someone to speak first. The divorce papers were already signed, sitting in a manila folder on the edge of the kitchen counter, waiting for one last appointment, one final signature. I had made peace with it, or at least convinced myself I had. What I hadn't prepared for was learning that in that final week of our marriage, while we were still legally tied together, still eating meals in the same house and folding laundry from the same dryer, my husband had taken my daughter-in-law to bed. And he didn't even try to hide it. Not really. Because people like Tom and Rachel don't think they need to hide. They think their charm and their excuses are enough to soften any edge, to smooth over betrayal with a wink and a pat on the back. I didn't scream when I found out. I didn't throw things or pack a suitcase or make dramatic announcements at the dinner table. Instead, I did what I do best. I took a breath, I smiled, and I waited. Because there's power in silence, especially when it's intentional. There's something about watching someone smile at you, believing they've won, while you quietly place the pieces of their downfall one by one, like tiles on a chessboard. That night at the birthday dinner, with Rachel sitting across from me in her pretty floral dress, acting every bit the devoted wife and daughter-in-law, I raised my glass to toast my son and thought, she has no idea what's coming. But I wasn't always this composed. The truth is, the week leading up to that dinner almost broke me. It started with a phone call from a friend of mine, someone who worked at the hotel where Tom used to hold his client meetings. She called just to say hello, but then her voice shifted and she said, "Karen, I think you should know something." That was the first crack. I asked her to tell me plainly and she hesitated, but eventually she said she'd seen Tom and Rachel there, not once but twice, checking in late in the evening, always with that same look people wear when they think no one's watching. My heart didn't stop. It just slowed, like it was trying to shield itself from what it already suspected. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask questions. I drove to that hotel myself the next day and asked for a copy of the security log under a fake name I had once used for a local club membership. I still can't believe they handed it over, but there it was. Dates, times, signatures. Their names written right there in black ink, like it was nothing. The hardest part wasn't the confirmation. It was sitting through dinner with my son that night, pretending to be fine, listening to him gush about how much Rachel had helped him through the stress of work lately, how grateful he was to have both of us in his life. I watched his face light up when she came into the room, and I felt something inside me twist and splinter, not from jealousy, but from grief. Grief for what I was losing, for the innocence he still had, for the woman I used to be before all of this hardened me. But I smiled anyway. I told him I was proud. I kissed his forehead like I did when he was 6 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. And then I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and cried harder than I had in years, with the faucet running just loud enough to drown out the sound. I thought about confronting them. I imagined storming into their house with the printouts in hand, slamming them down on the kitchen island and demanding answers. I even drafted a text to Rachel, just a single line. "I know what you did," but I never sent it. Something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the knowledge that people like them only feel powerful when you show them your pain. So I decided to give them none of it. Not a single tear they could witness. Not a single raised voice. Just silence and strategy. That's when I began to plan. I didn't know exactly what the end would look like. Not yet. But I knew I wanted it to be clean, quiet, and undeniable. The kind of revenge that doesn't ruin you, but reveals them. And so, while Rachel baked her pretty little cake and ordered candles shaped like numbers and posed for Instagram photos with my son, I stood in the background smiling for the camera, already holding the knife, not to strike, but to cut the rope when the moment came. And it would come. Because people who cheat, people who lie with smiles on their faces and gratitude in their voices, always think they're smarter than everyone else. But they forget one thing. They forget that the quiet ones, the ones who sit still and wait, are often the ones who already know everything. I didn't sleep much after that dinner. Even when I closed my eyes, my thoughts kept circling like birds that couldn't find a place to land, pecking at old memories and fresh betrayals, picking apart the pieces of a life I once thought was solid, but now realized had been hollowed out from underneath. I kept going through the past few months in my head, combing every conversation, every odd glance, every unexplained delay, like a detective too late to stop the crime, but desperate to understand how it happened. I started to see things differently, not just the obvious moments, but the tiny ones that had slipped past me while I was too busy trying to hold our family together with kindness and politeness, as if being a good woman, a good mother, a good wife, could protect me from cruelty. Rachel had always been careful. I'll give her that. She never did anything that could be called out directly. No lipstick stains, no perfume left behind, no suspicious texts on display. But there were other things, quieter things. The way she started dropping by the house even when Mark wasn't home, claiming she forgot something or just wanted to keep me company. At the time, I welcomed it. I thought she was trying to bond with me, to grow into the role of daughter I'd secretly longed for since my own mother passed. We'd sit at the kitchen table sipping coffee, and she would tilt her head just slightly when she asked me about Tom's schedule, laughing softly like it was all innocent curiosity. I would tell her things without thinking, when he had his golf games, his late meetings, his volunteer nights, not realizing that I was handing her the key to my husband's availability. And Tom. He wasn't just a fool. He was a man who believed that a long marriage earned him the right to stop trying, to drift into silence and self-interest, assuming I would always be there, folding his laundry and smiling through the disappointment. Somewhere along the way, he stopped looking at me like a woman and started treating me like wallpaper, something that had always been there, faded around the edges, too familiar to notice. I think Rachel gave him the thrill he craved, not just youth or beauty, but the feeling of being wanted again, of being important to someone who hadn't watched him grow older year by year. And I, blind in my efforts to keep peace, had unknowingly paved the road for them to find each other. Once I accepted that, the shame started to slip away and something else took its place. Not rage, not yet, but something colder and more focused. I started writing things down, not because I planned to expose them right away, but because I didn't trust my own memory anymore. I made notes about the way Rachel's mood lifted every time Tom walked into a room, about how she once brought him a bottle of his favorite whiskey for no particular reason, how she giggled when he teased her in front of the family, how she always made sure to touch his arm when she thanked him for passing the salt. I remembered one afternoon in particular. I had walked into the backyard with a tray of lemonade and caught them talking by the garden shed. They jumped apart too quickly, both offering a little too much explanation, both laughing a little too nervously. At the time, I blamed myself for being suspicious. Now I knew better. I also started watching Mark more closely. My son had always been trusting, almost to a fault. He believed in goodness, perhaps because I'd tried so hard to raise him with a heart that leaned toward compassion. But that made him vulnerable, especially to someone who knew how to wear a mask. Rachel treated him with just enough affection to keep him steady, but there was no real warmth when she looked at him anymore. She kissed him like she was clocking in for a shift, not out of love. I began to wonder if he suspected anything at all, if deep down he felt the distance growing but didn't know how to name it, or if he simply refused to see it, the way I had refused to see what was happening in my own marriage for far too long. I remembered a particular Sunday lunch where Rachel had made a roast and insisted we all eat together. The table was set beautifully, the napkins folded into little fans, the silverware perfectly aligned. She served Tom first, before her husband, and when he complimented the dish, her cheeks flushed in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with craving his approval. Mark didn't notice. He was too busy showing me pictures from a project he was leading at work. But I noticed. I watched her face as she reached across the table, and I saw something I couldn't unsee. It wasn't love. It was possession. She looked at my husband like he belonged to her already, like the ring on her finger gave her the right to take what was mine. The worst part was pretending to be grateful, pretending that I still believed in this little family we'd built around Sunday lunches and birthday candles, pretending that the crack in my chest wasn't growing wider every time Rachel touched my son with one hand and my husband with the other. But I kept playing my part. The supportive mother-in-law, the peaceful, soon-to-be ex-wife, the woman who knew how to stay composed no matter what. I kept smiling. I kept asking about her garden, about her job, about the trip she and Mark were planning to Napa next spring. And she kept smiling back, not realizing that every question I asked was a step in my plan. Every compliment I gave her was a thread I was winding around her wrists. I started making copies of things: hotel records, photographs, emails I found when Tom forgot to sign out of the shared tablet. Nothing explicit, nothing that would trigger censorship or scandal, but enough to draw the outline of betrayal. I stored them on a flash drive hidden in the back of the spice rack, somewhere no one ever looked, not even me until now. I even took photos of Rachel's handwriting from the guest book in our vacation cabin, just in case I ever needed to compare it to signatures elsewhere. It became a quiet obsession, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. I didn't want to destroy them in a burst of emotion. I wanted to be precise. I wanted to be surgical. And all the while, I kept rehearsing in my head what I would do when the moment came. I didn't want them to feel my pain. I wanted them to feel exposed, vulnerable, undone by their own arrogance. I didn't want them to cry. I wanted them to realize they had been watched, that someone had seen through the performance, that the woman they thought they could dismiss had been paying attention all along. That was the week I stopped being afraid of losing them. I had already lost them the moment they made their choice. What I hadn't lost, what I refused to lose, was my dignity, my clarity, and my right to decide what came next. And believe me, I was just getting started. It was a Tuesday evening when everything finally snapped into place. Not with a bang, not with confrontation or discovery in the traditional sense, but with a quiet, deliberate click. Like the last piece of a puzzle sliding into a corner you weren't sure existed until suddenly the whole picture stared back at you. That day had been unusually quiet from the start. The kind of stillness that makes your skin itch with a sense that something is shifting just beyond your reach, as if the house itself had stopped breathing while it waited for me to notice what had always been there. I had just finished watering the plants out front when I saw Rachel's car in the driveway, not parked where it usually was, but tucked halfway around the side of the house, shielded partially by the hedges like she didn't want to be seen.
And I remember thinking, even before I walked inside, that nothing good ever begins with a hidden vehicle and a silent house.
The lights were off in the living room. The air felt unusually still. I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock, but no voices, no footsteps, nothing to suggest someone was moving about or even trying to hide. I set my keys down slowly and stood in the entryway, not moving, just listening, like an animal sensing something in the woods. And then I heard it. Not words, not laughter, just the soft rhythm of movement, far back in the hall near the guest bedroom that Tom sometimes used when he had late-night calls and didn't want to disturb me. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. I didn't walk down the hall. I didn't want to see what I already knew. I turned around, stepped back outside, and sat in my car for nearly 40 minutes, staring through the windshield at nothing, letting the ache settle into my bones until it turned cold enough to carry. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. What I felt was beyond pain. It was stillness, the kind that comes after a long illness, when the fever finally breaks and you realize you're not going to die, but you're never going to be the same either. I watched the shadows stretch across the driveway as the sun sank behind the houses, and I thought about how many times I had stood up for Rachel, how many conversations I had softened in her defense, how many little kindnesses I had extended because I believed she was family, because I believed she loved my son, because I wanted to believe she loved all of us, and in return, she had made a mockery of everything I had built, not just my marriage, but my motherhood, my trust, my sense of safety in my own home. Eventually, I drove away. Not far, just a few blocks to a little gas station with bad coffee and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like angry bees. I sat in the car with the window cracked just slightly and stared at the reflection of my own face in the dark glass, and I saw someone I barely recognized, not because I looked older or sadder, although I did, but because something behind my eyes had changed. The softness was gone, the need to understand, to forgive, to explain. All of it had slipped away like steam on glass. What was left was clear, sharp, focused, and very, very quiet. When I came home, the house was dark again. Rachel's car was gone. Tom was in the kitchen, looking like nothing had happened, like he'd just come back from a jog or a long walk, like the air wasn't thick with betrayal and silence. He asked me if I wanted tea. I said no. He looked relieved. That, more than anything, confirmed it. He wasn't ashamed. He was just afraid of the inconvenience that came with being caught. I went upstairs, took a long shower, and sat on the edge of the bed in my robe, staring at the worn carpet and thinking about how strange it was that a person could share a life with someone for almost 4 decades and still not see who they truly were until it was too late. That night, I began the first real step in my plan. I opened the file on my laptop I had labeled simply as Receipts, a harmless name that wouldn't raise suspicion if someone happened to see it. I uploaded everything I had collected, the hotel logs, the photos, the copied messages, the screenshots, the travel points linked to Tom's account that didn't align with any family trip we'd taken. I scanned the note Rachel had left for me on Mother's Day. Sweet on the surface, but with timing that now felt bitter in hindsight. And saved it too, with a timestamp that placed her at our house the same afternoon she had met Tom at that hotel. I made multiple backups, placed one on a flash drive I hid in an old cereal box in the pantry, and mailed another to my sister on the coast with a vague note saying it was for safekeeping. I didn't want to burn them yet. I just wanted them to know eventually that I had known all along, and that I had been watching. But even as I did this, I felt something deeper start to rise. Not just the urge for justice, but a strange, painful pride. I had endured. I had remained whole. I had been broken open, yes, but not shattered, and that distinction meant everything. I wasn't plotting to humiliate them. I wasn't looking for drama or chaos or public scenes. What I wanted was much quieter. I wanted truth to sit beside them like an uninvited guest at the dinner table, like a shadow they couldn't shake no matter how brightly they smiled or how carefully they arranged the cutlery. I wanted Rachel to feel it when she poured my son's coffee in the morning, when she tucked her hair behind her ear, when she kissed his cheek goodnight. I wanted her to remember that I had looked her in the eye and smiled, knowing. And more than anything, I wanted her to wonder when the ground would give way beneath her, when the truth she thought was buried would come bubbling to the surface like water, breaking through a cracked foundation, because secrets don't stay hidden forever. Not when you've betrayed a woman who has nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to wait. That night, as I crawled under the covers beside the man who no longer knew me, I didn't feel rage. I felt something more dangerous. I felt ready. The morning of Mark's birthday arrived with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, but rather like the air is holding its breath, bracing for something it doesn't want to name. I stood in the kitchen, ironing the linen table runner I hadn't used in years, my hands moving slowly over the fabric as my mind wandered to all the birthdays before this one. The Lego cakes, the cowboy themes, the sleepovers with sticky fingers and juice-stained paper hats. Memories that now felt like relics from another life, from another version of me that still believed in things staying whole if you loved them hard enough. This year's dinner wasn't about celebration. It was a stage, and I was about to step onto it. Rachel arrived early, of course. She always did when she wanted control. She breezed in through the side door with her arms full of grocery bags and her face lit up with that carefully curated smile that somehow managed to look both grateful and triumphant at the same time. She wore a pale pink sweater that matched the icing on the cake she'd baked, a detail that might have seemed sweet once, but now struck me as calculated, like everything she touched had to coordinate, had to present the image of the perfect wife, the golden daughter-in-law, the woman who could do no wrong. I thanked her, as always, took the bags from her hands, and watched as she floated around my kitchen with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped feeling like a guest. Tom came in shortly after, whistling to himself like a man who had nothing to fear, dropping a bottle of wine on the counter with a casualness that made my jaw tighten. He didn't look at me long, just enough to nod and ask about the roast before disappearing into the living room to check the score of a game he wasn't even really watching. I stood at the sink, rinsing carrots I didn't even want to serve, and for a brief moment I imagined myself turning to Rachel and saying it all. Laying the evidence across the table like a hand of cards and watching her expression collapse. But I didn't. I hadn't waited this long just to make noise. I had something else in mind, and it started with letting them believe they still had control. Guests trickled in, a few neighbors, Mark's old friend from college, my sister Nora, who flew in from Santa Barbara just for the night and gave me a long, searching hug that said more than any question she might have asked. The table was set beautifully, if I say so myself, flickering candles in antique holders, napkins folded into gentle waves, the roast resting on a porcelain platter I'd only ever used twice before. Everything looked perfect. That was the point. The room buzzed with polite laughter and the clink of glasses, and if anyone noticed that my smile didn't quite reach my eyes, they said nothing. Rachel sat beside Mark, her hand resting lightly on his knee, her other hand occasionally brushing Tom's arm in ways that could still pass as innocent. Barely. And then came the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated, the toast. Mark stood, holding his glass, thanking everyone for coming, especially me and Rachel, and I watched as his eyes filled with the kind of emotion that only comes from believing you're surrounded by people who truly love you. It broke my heart. I wanted to protect him from what I knew, to shield him from the truth that would soon begin to unravel everything he'd built. When he sat back down and turned to Rachel with a look of pure devotion, I had to press my fingers into my palm under the table to keep from reaching across and pulling him away from her. And that's when it happened. The unexpected moment that nearly brought everything crashing down. Rachel reached into a small gift bag and pulled out a handmade scrapbook she'd spent weeks putting together, or so she claimed. She opened it and began turning pages aloud, narrating the memories she'd collected. Their first date, their first apartment, the trip to the lake house with our family. She passed it around the table, each guest flipping through and smiling until it reached me. And as I took it into my hands, I froze. Tucked between two pages, just barely peeking out from behind a photo of Mark and Rachel at the cabin, was a receipt. A folded receipt from the hotel. The same hotel where she'd met Tom. My hotel. My proof. Somehow, by mistake or arrogance, she had left it in there, half buried like a smoking gun wrapped in gift paper. Time slowed. I felt the blood drain from my face, my fingers trembling slightly as I slid the paper out just far enough to read the name. It was hers. The date matched exactly. I looked up, saw Tom glance at me, and for a second I thought he'd seen it too, that he would speak, that he'd say something, anything, and the whole room would fracture. But then Mark laughed, a full, honest laugh at something Rachel had just said, and the tension snapped. I folded the paper gently back into the book, closed it, and passed it to Nora without a word. No one saw, no one knew. Not yet. The rest of the night passed in a blur of conversation and candlelight, but I barely heard any of it. I kept glancing at Rachel, wondering if she even realized what she'd done, or if she was so confident in her performance that she thought she'd never slip. Tom remained distant but polite, never meeting my gaze for more than a second, and I played my part, smiled for the camera, posed beside the birthday cake, and clapped when Mark blew out the candles. But underneath it all, the weight of that receipt in my hand still lingered. The proof, the mistake, the key. As the guests began to leave and the night wound down, I stood by the sink again, my hands deep in soapy water, watching the bubbles rise and pop like the illusion that had just barely held together that evening. Rachel came up beside me, drying dishes, chatting about plans for the weekend, her voice light and sugary, and I nodded along, never breaking rhythm. But in my chest, a quiet certainty settled. This wasn't the time. Not yet. But the moment was coming, and when it did, she wouldn't even see it coming. Because the best kind of revenge isn't loud or messy. It's quiet, unexpected, and delivered with the same grace they once mistook for weakness. The morning after the dinner felt different, not in any obvious way. The sun still rose behind the same kitchen window, the coffee still brewed with its familiar hiss, and the mail still thudded against the front door just after 9. But in me, something had shifted for good. There was no longer a question hovering in the corners of my mind, no more wondering if I was imagining things, no more clinging to the fragile hope that maybe, somehow, I was wrong. The mistake Rachel had made, tucking that receipt into the scrapbook like it was nothing, had ended whatever was left of the illusion. She had handed me the truth with her own perfectly manicured fingers, and in doing so, she had also handed me permission to let go of everything I'd been carrying for far too long. That morning, I didn't cry. I packed. I moved with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. I filled 3 suitcases and a pair of plastic storage bins with the things that mattered most to me. My mother's jewelry box, my father's military photographs, the recipe cards in my own handwriting that had grown faded around the edges with use. I didn't bother with furniture or large things. I had no interest in dragging pieces of a broken life into the next chapter. I was heading to my sister Nora's house on the coast, a quiet little place with salt in the air and enough space to breathe again. She had offered before, many times, but I had always said no, always believed that something here was still worth holding on to. But not anymore. The house had become a stage, a museum of betrayal. It no longer felt like mine. Tom didn't even ask where I was going. When I told him I'd be leaving that afternoon, he barely looked up from his phone, just nodded like I'd said I was running to the grocery store for eggs. That told me everything I needed to know. He didn't care, not about the marriage, not about the family, not about the life we'd built together brick by brick over nearly 4 decades. And yet, I didn't hate him. That surprised me. What I felt for him now was something far quieter, like watching a tree rot from the inside while the leaves still look green to everyone else. I had mourned the man he used to be, but I had no desire to save the one he had become. Rachel didn't call that day, nor the next. It wasn't until a week later, after I had settled into Nora's guest room and begun taking long, slow walks by the water each morning, that I heard from Mark. His voice over the phone was shaky, strained in a way that made my heart clench, even before he said anything meaningful. He told me things had been strange at home. Rachel had become distant, irritable, picking fights over little things, disappearing for hours and offering half-hearted explanations when she returned. He told me he had found a strange charge on their shared credit card, a boutique hotel downtown that neither of them had ever mentioned before, and that when he asked her about it, she had brushed him off. But what hit me hardest was when he said that something about the way she looked at him had changed, like he was no longer the person she was trying to impress, but simply the one standing in her way. I listened. I let him speak. And when he asked me if I thought something was going on, I didn't give him everything. Not yet. I simply said that sometimes people reveal who they are slowly, and when they do, you can either ignore it or begin to face it. He was quiet after that. I think part of him already knew. Maybe he'd known for longer than he realized, but it was easier to believe in the version of Rachel he had first fallen for than to accept the woman she had become. That kind of recognition doesn't come easily, especially when love is tangled in it. Over the next few weeks, everything started to unravel. Rachel quit her job without warning. She canceled the trip to Napa she'd been planning with Mark for months. Tom stopped returning Mark's calls altogether. Eventually, the truth began to slip through in fragments. A parking ticket issued near the hotel on a weekday morning. A witness who mentioned seeing Rachel with someone who wasn't Mark. An overheard voicemail from Tom left playing just a little too loudly on the kitchen counter. The evidence piled up not as a sudden explosion, but as a quiet accumulation of fractures that could no longer be patched over. And I watched it all from a distance. I didn't interfere. I didn't call or send messages or drop hints. I simply waited. I took my morning walks by the sea. I made soup from scratch. I sat with Nora on the porch and listened to the wind rustle through the trees as if the whole world was finally beginning to exhale. Sometimes I wondered what Rachel felt as the walls began to close in, whether she panicked, whether she tried to deny it, or whether she simply assumed she could talk her way out of it again, as she always had before. But part of me believed that, deep down, she knew this time was different. This time, she had played her final card, and it had turned out to be the one that revealed her entire hand. When Mark showed up on my doorstep 2 weeks later, his face drawn and tired, I didn't have to ask why. He sat beside me on the porch, silent at first, and then he told me that he had moved out. He didn't say the words directly, but the meaning was clear. He had seen enough. He had felt the shift. He had followed the cracks to their source and found the rot at the center. I didn't tell him I'd known for weeks. I didn't tell him about the file on the flash drive, or the receipt in the scrapbook, or the phone calls I never returned. I just took his hand, held it gently, and let him talk until the sun dipped low behind the hills. He asked me how I had known to leave when I did. I told him that when the house you've built starts to feel like a stranger's, staying becomes more painful than walking away. And the truth is, I had been gone long before I packed a suitcase. My body just needed time to catch up with my heart. That night, after Mark went to bed in the guest room and the house was quiet again, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring out the window at the moonlight stretching across the water. I felt no triumph, no celebration, no gloating. What I felt was closure, peace, a sense that the storm had passed, not because I had destroyed them, but because I had refused to let them destroy me. But the story wasn't quite over yet, because just when I thought everything had settled, something happened that none of us saw coming. I had thought the worst was behind me. The air in my sister's house had become softer, the mornings quieter, and the grief that had once lived in my chest like a stone pressing against my ribs had finally started to dissolve into something I could carry without effort. Mark had filed for divorce, Tom had gone silent, and Rachel had, for the most part, disappeared. There were rumors that she'd moved in with a coworker out of state, someone younger, someone foolish enough not to ask too many questions. And for a little while, I allowed myself to believe that the story had ended. Not perfectly, but with enough resolution that I could begin again. But life rarely ends stories where we expect it to. 3 months after Mark moved out, I received a formal envelope in the mail, one of those heavy, cream-colored ones that never brings anything good. Inside was a legal notice, a motion filed by Rachel against Mark and, by extension, against me. She was suing him for emotional distress, citing claims of manipulation, invasion of privacy, and, to my disbelief, harassment. She claimed that I had deliberately poisoned her marriage by fabricating lies, hacking her private information, and staging evidence to make her look unfaithful. Her signature, sharp and looping, stared back at me from the bottom of the page, and for a moment the room around me blurred into a soft hum of disbelief. I had known she was capable of betrayal. I hadn't known she was capable of reinvention on this scale. Turning herself from the predator into the victim, rewriting the narrative in legal ink, banking on the world believing the face she wore in public instead of the one I had seen behind closed doors. The case was flimsy, based on speculation, weak accusations, no true proof, but it was enough to shake Mark, to drag him into depositions and meetings and whispered questions about his character. He didn't ask me for help. He didn't want to pull me into the mess, but I knew this fight wasn't just his anymore. She was trying to rewrite my silence into guilt. That's when I made a decision I hadn't planned for. I opened the drawer where I had placed the flash drive all those months ago, the one I had sworn I wouldn't use unless absolutely necessary. I stared at it for a long time, then slid it into the computer, watching the folder open like a door I hadn't walked through in ages. The images, the logs, the travel records, everything I had quietly collected and buried, now rose up like witnesses called to the stand. I organized it all carefully, methodically, without anger, but with a sense of duty. I wasn't doing this to punish. I was doing it to protect what was still worth defending. And then I found something I hadn't noticed before. Buried deep in one of the hotel logs was a line item. A payment made under Tom's name, but billed to a corporate account I didn't recognize. Curious, I followed the trail. One click became another, and within 20 minutes I had uncovered an entire sublayer of receipts and transaction notes linking Rachel and Tom not just to a personal affair, but to a series of financial manipulations involving a shared account Mark had trusted them with years ago during a real estate deal. They hadn't just betrayed him emotionally. They had taken money, his money, hidden it, used it. And now that their relationship had fallen apart, neither one had come clean about it. I printed everything. I packed it into a neat folder and gave it to Mark with a quiet explanation. He didn't say much, just looked at me with wide, stunned eyes, the kind you only see on someone who's just realized they've been standing on a rug that was never real to begin with. Within days, his attorney filed a counterclaim, not just against Rachel, but against Tom. The case flipped overnight. The narrative shifted. Rachel's story began to unravel in front of her, thread by thread, as her own paper trail betrayed her far more convincingly than I ever could have with words. In the end, she lost everything. The court dismissed her claim with prejudice, which meant she couldn't refile. She was ordered to pay back what she had taken, along with legal fees and a formal apology. Not to me, but to Mark, which in its own way meant more. Tom's name was removed from the trust. His reputation within his professional circle quietly dissolved, invitations stopped arriving, contracts were not renewed, and without the shelter of our shared life, he faded into a quiet retirement no one celebrated. Mark reclaimed his home, sold the house they had once shared, and bought a small property in the mountains where he could hike and think and heal, and I found peace. Not the kind that comes from revenge or even justice, but the kind that comes from surviving, from knowing that you saw the worst in people and didn't let it turn you into something worse yourself. I had waited. I had watched. I had smiled at the woman who betrayed me, not because I was naive or afraid, but because I understood something she never did, that dignity, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim, but silence, when held long enough, becomes power. And now, when I walk along the beach behind my sister's house and feel the cold air on my cheeks, I no longer carry the weight of what they did. I carry the strength of what I didn't let them take. But I'll leave you with this, because maybe this story isn't just mine. Have you ever smiled at someone who thought they got away with hurting you? And if you did you ever feel that quiet, steady thrill of knowing you didn't need to raise your voice to win? I'd love to hear your story.